Well, I think the problem with what Andrew was saying was that if you have pay rises of, say, 10% in one area of the public sector, you will very, very quickly be facing demands for 10% across all the public sector that employs, and the public sector occupies, about 40% or so of the GDP of the country. Very, very quickly, you're embedding higher inflation over a longer period of time, and then you get into a spiral.
Another Conservative MP telling viewers we can't give our teachers inflation-busting pay rises because it will embed or even accelerate inflation. In other words, public sector workers, our teachers, our nurses and our doctors, who've already suffered more than a decade of crappy real terms pay cuts, should accept yet another crappy real terms pay cut so the government can bring down inflation, a problem none of them are actually responsible for. It's just complete bollocks. A claim which has been debunked over and over again by economists, but which even the Prime Minister can't stop himself running around the country repeating.
Look, the most important thing we can do to help people is to control inflation. We've got to reduce inflation. That's what's making life difficult for nurses and for everyone else in the country. And a big part of how we are going to grip and reduce inflation is by having restraint when it comes to pay settlements.
Sunak has also dispatched ministers to shamelessly repeat the claim on UK news shows.
The worst thing that we could do domestically would be to significantly increase public sector pay.
You know, one of the factors that we have to consider, particularly at a time of high inflation, is if we do inflation matching pay rises, that can actually drive inflation further.
But just like practically everything else this government says, it's completely untrue. How many times do I have to point this out? If a private sector company increases its wages, yes, that goes directly into the cost of making that product and service, and that might end up increasing the price. But that's not the case with public sector workers such as healthcare and education, which are free at the point of use. That means consumers do not pay for them directly, so they do not affect the inflation statistics. The Prime Minister knows that. And so do all the ministers and Conservative MPs shamelessly running about repeating it. The claim's also being completely rubbished by most economists who agree it's only private sector wage increases that have an impact on inflation. Don't just take my word for it. Listen to Stephanie Flanders, an expert economist and head of Bloomberg News Economics, speaking to the BBC's Laura Kunsberg on April 16th.
They're concerned that inflation, which we know is putting so much pressure on people, will be bumped further up if they hand over lots more money to the public sector. As a very expert economist, does that stack up?
It is not something that economists tend to agree with, I'm sorry, because it is very different. If you have a private sector company increase its wages, well, that goes directly into the cost of making that product or service and may well then end up meaning they have to increase the price in the shops. Obviously, that's not the case with public sector workers. There isn't a price that's going to go up. Of course, there's a bill to be paid, and one always would have to ask questions about where the money's going to come from. Is it going to squeeze other things in the health? If it's going to increase health spending, which would mean it was additional, obviously there is an additional demand on the economy which could potentially increase inflation at the margins. But I think this equivalence, people understand that if a private sector company raises wages, that's going to add to costs and to prices. It just isn't the same thing for public sector workers. And when you've had the kind of gap that's opened up since 2010 between public and private sector workers in terms of their pay, even with the difference of conditions and other things, that is in itself an issue in terms of morale and in terms of the sort of stability of the system.
And remember, the public sector labour force makes up only about 17% of the total workforce, so it has much less of an impact on the economy than the private sector. So when the government cites this as a reason for not giving our teachers and our nurses and our doctors the fair pay rise we all know they deserve,
the worst thing that we could do domestically would be to significantly increase public sector pay.
please remember they're again talking complete bollocks.